Hi guys, this is Weasel for PokerBrainiacs.com, and we are going to be continuing our video series on 3-betting strategy, and this is part 2. We looked at briefly at some of the reasons why you 3-bet, and we began by considering value 3-bets. And we are now going to consider the situations where we'd want to 3-bet as a bluff. And of course we are 3-betting with the intention of taking down the pot pre-flop, so our goal is to immediately win what's in the pot. And the best players to target are those with a high attempt to steal, so they're opening a wide range, and a high fold to 3-bet, so they're folding a large percentage of this range to a 3-bet. We want to 3-bet hands which aren't strong enough to call. And if we think back to the ace-jack offsuit example in video 1, we saw how it was a mistake to 3-bet ace-jack offsuit because we were effectively turning it into a bluff in a situation where we had a profitable flat call. So we want to take hands which aren't profitable to flat call, and that way we are still going to maximize our equity. So we take something that we didn't really want to play anyway, and we use that to 3-bet bluff against our opponents. Against players that don't adjust, your 3-bet bluffing range can literally contain 100% bluffs and 0% value hands. And if you think of an example of a fictional player who in reality really is folding 100% to 3-bets, these players probably don't actually exist, but let's say he's folding 100% of hands to 3-bets, including pocket aces. What hands would you take to 3-bet against his opponent? It'd be pretty stupid to take a hand like pocket kings and 3-bet it, because you just know this player is folding 100% of the time. In fact, by 3-betting pocket kings, you are throwing it into the muck. You would realistically take hands you didn't want to play. So if you get dealt 2-7 offsuit, you don't really want to play that. Why not use it to 3-bet bluff against a player that is folding to 100% of 3-bets? Now, of course, most players are not folding to 100% of 3-bets, but the principle still applies. You want to take hands which you don't really want to play. They're not strong enough to call, but you can use them to take down the pot. And in practice, you won't necessarily be using a hand like 2-7 off. You'll be taking a hand like Queen-9 suited, Ace-X suited, King-X suited. Hands which weren't strong enough to play but are still going to have equity because most villains aren't folding 100% to 3-bets, and you will eventually get called some of the time. And when this happens, you want to be in a situation where you at least have a hand that might flop something. So you take slightly better hands, but hands that you were probably going to fold anyway. And while against some opponents we can 3-bet a range that's 100% bluffs, against better opponents we are going to want to polarize our 3-betting range. And this basically means that yes, we're going to still 3-bet our bluffs, but we are going to want to include some strong value hands in amongst our bluffs. And the reason we do this is it stops our opponent being able to just insta 4-bet any 2 cards, because if he knows that our 3-bet range is 100% bluffs, then he can literally just take any 2 cards and just 4-bet us 100% of the time. So against slightly smarter, more perceptive opponents, you are going to need to include some value hands in your 3-betting range to protect yourself. But these are going to be hands that are the top end of your value range. You don't want to include a hand like ace-jack offsuit, for the reasons discussed in video 1. But we still have the ability to weight our range towards bluffs where appropriate. So we might find that it's still going to work fine against a villain that's folding a large amount of the time. And so long as we show up with a premium hand, say perhaps 10 or 20% of the time, we are still going to get away with making a lot of our 3-bets as bluffs, and we can call this weighting our 3-bet range toward bluffs. So against the vast majority of opponents, you want to, at least opponents with a high fold to 3-bet and a high attempt to steal, you want to 3-bet a polarized range which is weighted towards bluffs. So just to reiterate the types of hands we want to 3-bet, hands that are the top of our range that aren't strong enough to call. So Queen 9 suited, Ace X suited, King X suited, and we can also take some of these suited connectors, perhaps suited 1 gappers. Again, if they're not profitable to call, and a lot of suited 1 gappers might not be, but if we have a hand like 7/8 suited, if the player that is open raising, we think we have good implied odds against that player, either because they are perhaps aggressive or they have a very strong hand, then we are not going to want to take a hand as good looking as 7/8 suited and turn it into a 3-bet bluff if we can potentially play it in position with good implied odds. However, if we are not going to have the odds to play a hand like 7/8 suited in position, then by all means take a hand like that and turn it into a 3-bet bluff. But in general, you don't want to turn hands quite that good into 3-bet bluffs unless you have a very specific reason. But if it's not going to be profitable to play a suited connector anyway, then you can definitely turn it into a 3-bet bluff, which is probably better than folding, and it's probably better than 3-betting something like 7-deuce offsuit, because you will get called some of the time. The same goes for small pocket pairs. Yes, you can turn them into a bluff, but only if you can't set mine profitably, because if you can set mine profitably, you are effectively throwing away the value of your set mine opportunity by turning the hand into a bluff. But if you can't profitably set mine and your only other option is to fold, then they become okay hands to 3-bet, because you may take the pot down. If you do get called, you have the possibility of making a very strong hand and stacking your opponent. We are going to want to 3-bet as a bluff less often out of position, and the reason is we are going to have less fold equity in general. So if a player opens on the button and we 3-bet bluff from the big blind, we are going to get called a lot more frequently in this situation, because our opponent can continue with a wider range of hands. He knows that if he calls, he may have some opportunity post-flop to make some plays. Maybe you can raise some flops or raise some turns. So villain is going to be continuing much wider when he's in position. Whereas if we are, say, on the button and we 3-bet against villain's cutoff open raising range, villain knows if he flat calls, he is going to have to play the hand out of position in a 3-bet pot. So we are going to have more fold equity in general when we are in position. In terms of the hands we 3-bet bluff with out of position, we want to partially merge our polarized 3-bet range, and this perhaps sounds like a bit of a contradiction. What I'm really saying is, when you are 3-betting out of position and you know you are going to get called slightly more frequently, you want to have in your range more hands that have good absolute equity. So you don't want a hand like 7/9 suited, which is going to play okay in position when you have good shots at taking the pot down, but it's not going to play well out of position in the 3-bet pot where you've effectively got 9 high. You are never going to have the option to check that hand down, and it's going to be difficult to take the pot down out of position, because your 9 high is never going to be good if you were to check. So you want to take hands that have better absolute equity. So even a hand like King 6 offsuit, which is a terrible hand, and perhaps you could choose to 3-bet such a hand against certain opponents, but the point is it's going to have a little bit more absolute equity than a hand like 9/7 suited, because King 6 has King high, and obviously you'd perhaps prefer to 3-bet slightly better hands, but the point is you want to partially merge your polarized 3-bet range, so just include more hands with big cards in them. In general, we want to 3-bet bluff versus late position openers more frequently. And the reason is they are opening wider from these positions. At least traditionally they are opening wider from these positions. So if someone's on the button, it's possible that they've maybe read somewhere in a book or they've seen on a forum somewhere that it's profitable for them to open any two cards from the button, in which case their range is going to be a lot wider on the button. Perhaps the same applies for the small blind. Maybe they're still opening quite wide from the cutoff. The point is they are going to have a higher attempt to steal, or perhaps even it's more correct to say they are going to have more hands in their range at opening with than compared to a hand they open from middle position and under the gun, which is typically going to be a stronger range that they are opening from these positions. But as we will go on to see, it's not necessarily the case, but you just need to know that on level 1 you need to be 3-betting versus late position openers more frequently. And this leads us on to the topic of positional awareness, and it deals with what exactly do I mean when I say you need to do this on level 1. Your 3-bet, whether it's a value or a bluff, represents varying amounts of strength depending on the exact positions involved. So which positions am I referring to here? Well, here is an example of 4 positions, and these are the ones that are typically interpreted as the 3-better having a light range. Perhaps the button 3-bets versus a cutoff open, the big blind 3-bets versus a button open, the small blind 3-bets versus a button open, or perhaps the big blind 3-bets versus a small blind open. These are the situations where players are traditionally 3-betting light, because in these spots the open raiser is also light. It's typical that a button open raiser, any given button opening raiser, is quite possibly going to be light. Perhaps they've read in a forum somewhere that they can open wide from the button, and so the small blind or the big blind, when they proceed to 3-bet, it looks light. The next 2 positions are interpreted as slightly tighter: small blind versus cutoff, big blind 3-bets versus cutoff, and part of the reason is because the cutoff is not going to be opening as wide as the button, so these 3-bets look a little stronger. They still look somewhat wide. 3-bets against a middle position open typically look quite strong, so a lot of the time you might end up being given a lot of credit 3-betting in this particular spot. And then finally there are the positions that typically look very strong, and these are 3-bets against an under the gun open, because typically someone's under the gun opening range is going to be a lot stronger than their button opening range. Therefore a 3-bet against their under the gun opening range is going to look very strong. What are the implications of this? It's pretty much this, that against a good regular, or at least a thinking regular, you may get less credit for 3-bets versus late position opens because they are expecting you to 3-bet light in these positions, but you may get more credit for 3-betting versus early position opens. So on level 1, perhaps we're playing against a fish, we should presumably bet 3-bet as a bluff, lighter against that button and cutoff opens and the small blind opens, but we should tighten up against the under the gun and MP opens, because perhaps it's a fish that has some concept of position and is opening quite tight from under the gun and MP, and we don't want to 3-bet bluff against a tighter range because we are just not going to get folds as often. However, against a good regular who expects us to only be 3-betting against his under the gun or MP open raising range with a very strong hand, he can perhaps give us a lot more credit and may even end up folding some very strong hands because he gives us so much credit. Conversely, when we say 3-bet the button open of a good regular, he may look at that and think, well, it's so standard for people to 3-bet lights here that I'm just going to play back, put in a 4-bet. So the spots you choose to 3-bet bluff are very villain dependent. In general, you should be 3-bet bluffing against late position opens, But you can make more advanced plays. Perhaps we can think of them as level 2 plays, where we can 3-bet bluff against a player in a position where we wouldn't normally 3-bet bluff, and if this player knows that, then they give us credit for being very strong. So 3-bet more frequently against early position opens if villain is a regular, but we should expect to get played back at, and that's either him calling or making light 4-bets with a high frequency when we are 3-betting versus one of his late position opens. What are the implications of what we've said on value 3-bets, however? When we are 3-betting versus early positions, we are going to need to expect a higher fold to 3-bet perhaps than we would expect from that player if he was open raising from an early position. And if we think again back to the ace-jack offsuit example in video 1, when a player has a high fold to 3-bet, we need to be very careful about which hands we 3-bet for value, because we don't want to fall into the trap of value 3-betting and then isolating ourselves against a range that we have a limited amount of equity against. In fact, we may be in bad shape against that range. So basically, we need to be very careful about value 3-betting against under the gun and middle position opens. Flatting with pocket queens plus and ace king becomes a very viable option. In fact, I would even go so far as to recommend that this is your standard play. If a regular under the gun or MP open raises and you are on the button with pocket queens, I recommend that your default play is actually to flat pocket queens and to flat ace king. When you find yourself in games with certain dynamics or against certain players, perhaps the under the gun opener has no concept of position and is just calling all types of 3-bets, then of course go ahead and 3-bet your queens or 3-bet your ace king. But in general, I think it's going to be a very viable option to flat these hands. And the same even goes with kings and aces. If you think back to the example of the player that folds 100% to 3-bets, you'd never 3-bet aces and kings. Well, these players might not be folding 100% after they open raise under the gun, but they are certainly going to be folding a lot more often than they would if you were 3-betting in a late position battle. So you may in actual fact find that you end up getting more value from your pocket aces and pocket kings from flatting them versus under the gun and MP opens. Plus you also put yourself in a situation where your hand is somewhat under-repped because they expect you to 3-bet pocket aces even against an under the gun open. So not value 3-betting against early position opens can often be a very effective strategy for maximizing your EV. We're going to talk briefly about the third reason we mentioned, the third reason we have for 3-betting pre-flop, and that reason is 3-betting to set up a steal. For example, perhaps our opponent doesn't fold to 3-bets very often. Does that mean we can't 3-bet him with a hand that isn't strictly a strong value hand? Well, yes we can if our opponent is the type of player who plays fit or fold on the flop. So he is going to be calling our 3-bets, perhaps out of position preferably, with a wide amount of hands, and then he is going to be playing fit or fold on the flop. So he is pretty much going to be donating money to you by calling your 3-bets and then folding on the flop. And in this particular situation, the range of hands we 3-bet can literally be any hand, because we can maybe 3-bet do 7 offsuit and villain calls and we take it down the flop, and it's still going to be profitable if he's folding enough on the flop. However, there's no need to do it with a hand so weak. In fact, this strategy quite possibly works best with a merged value range. So rather than bluffing against this player who is never folding to 3-bets, your best strategy is just going to be to expand your value range. So in this particular case, we bet wider for value, and perhaps you can even put yourself in a situation where you can 3-bet some of the hands that I recommend you don't 3-bet. Perhaps you can even start 3-betting hands like suited connectors, or maybe even some of the mid-high pocket pairs. And the reason being because they are going to be a lot easier to play on the flop or post flop because you know how villain is going to respond. So I recommend this strategy best with a merged value range rather than any pure bluffs, although technically it can be profitable with both value and bluff hands. And we're not just considering post-flop steals here, we also have the opportunity of stealing immediately from our opponent pre-flop if he's the type of opponent who is going to 4-bet us light and then fold. And what we can do is we can take our merged value range and we can 3-bet it with the intention of 5-bet jamming over an opponent who likes to 4-bet light a lot. And the best hands to do this are hands with good absolute equity, but they are not so good that we wouldn't prefer to flat them. So if we have a very strong hand, there's no need to maybe put ourselves in this situation, or not a very strong hand, but a hand again like ace jack, which we don't want to get 4-bet against when we hold this hand, and we're not comfortable 5-bet jamming, but we're perfectly happy taking a hand that we wouldn't necessarily want to play anyway. And good hands to do this are things like suited aces, which usually have a good amount of equity against pretty much any hand, even if they aren't a clear favourite. And again, you don't need to be a clear favourite if you get called. This is profitable because of the fold equity you will have when you 5-bet and the times that villain 4-bets and then folds your 5-bet. So when you are called, you are expecting to get the money behind. But good hands to do it with are things like suited aces, which have good equity, pocket pairs, which have good equity. So again, when I said before about not 3-betting hands like pocket 5s or pocket 8s for value, in this particular case you could consider it a type of thin value bet and 3-bet the hand like pocket 8s because you have the intention of jamming it over a 4-bet and primarily as a bluff, but you also know that when you get called you are going to have a good amount of equity. Even if villain shows up with a premium like ace king, then you are still going to be a slight favourite in the hand with your pocket 8s. So this is the third reason really why you want to 3-bet. So we've considered 3-betting as a bluff, 3-betting for value, and finally 3-betting to set up a steal either post flop or directly pre-flop. We are now going to talk briefly about what we do if we are not the pre-flop aggressor and we are the player that is facing a 3-bet from villain. First of all, we are going to discuss out of position, because I think in some ways it's a lot clearer the options we have in this particular situation, just down to the fact that our options are somewhat limited. And the reason is, as a very general strategy, don't flat 3-bets out of position, 100 big blinds deep at least. Just don't do it. It's not going to be a winning strategy in the long run. It's going to be difficult to play your hand out of position, and what players end up doing is they're facing a villain that is 3-betting them quite light, and they realize they're being 3-bet light, and they know that they have to play back against this light 3-better somehow. And what they end up doing is pretty much making one of the worst possible adjustments, and that is they flat call the 3-bet out of position, and then they just start check folding any flop that they haven't hit, and it's pretty much one of the worst things you can do. And I do say in general because there are some situations where we might consider flatting a 3-bet out of position. And these are the exceptions. You have a strong hand, and by strong I literally mean ace king or king kings plus, pocket kings plus, so something that's considered a slow play. And villain's range ideally needs to be both wide and polarized. So basically you're in a situation where you know that villain's range has some strong value hands, but it also has some of the bottom end of villain's range, some bluffs which you have very good equity against. And by 4-betting in this particular spot, you are going to fold out villain's 3-bet bluffs, and villain is going to continue with all his hands that have better equity against something like pocket kings or ace king. So pretty much you are isolating yourself against a part of villain's range that isn't as favourable for you. Obviously, when you have a hand like pocket kings, it won't necessarily matter so much. You'll probably still be ahead of that range, but it would be nice if you could keep in all the bluff part of villain's range, and one way you can do that is by flatting. And in general, anytime villain is polarized, flatting is going to be a good strategy with a value hand, because flatting against a polarized range means you are going to keep in all the bluff hands in villain's range. So in general, when we are out of position and we are facing a 3-bet, we normally have one of two options, and our default play pretty much should be to fold. And so long as someone is not going crazy with their 3-bets, we really should just consider folding a lot of hands. Even hands as strong as ace queen. If we open a hand like ace queen from the cutoff and the button 3-bets us, and we look at his 3-bet percent stat and say it's something like 3 or 4%, the chances are we are just not doing that good against his 3-betting range, because he is 3-betting quite tight anyway. Yes, it's maybe in a spot where we could expect him to be 3-betting light some of the time, but that doesn't necessarily mean he is. It is going to be fine to fold hand as strong as ace queen out of position, maybe even a hand like pocket jacks, or if someone is really tight, you can literally just throw a hand like pocket queens in the muck, especially out of position. And yes, it may seem tight, but poker is a game of relative hand strength, and if your hand is behind villain's range, it doesn't matter how strong your hand is in the absolute sense. It doesn't matter if you've got pocket queens or whether you've got ace king. If villain is a tight 3-better and you're out of position and behind villain's range, it doesn't matter how good you are probably not going to make it profitable, at least 100 big blinds deep at any rate. So in general, we want to be folding or 4-betting. Of course, one downside to slow playing some big hands and flatting is that if villain is perceptive, he may begin to realize that the only hands you're flatting out of position are strong value hands, if you are a good player at least, and therefore your 4-betting range is going to be somewhat lighter, because if you're slow playing aces and kings and ace king, then you don't have these hands in your 4-bet range, and villain is going to be able to play more effectively against your 4-bets. If, however, villain is 3-betting very wide, then you can start playing back with some hands. You can consider 4-bet bluffing. So here I put fold versus tight 3-betters, and I put less than 4%. So that's a good guide for you to go by. If someone's 3-betting 4% of the time, they are probably not 3-betting that light. In a 4% range, there might be the odd light 3-bet, but until you have a big sample size, if you see someone is 3-betting 4%, you may as well just give them credit. If a range is larger than 8%, then you can perhaps consider that definitely has some light 3-bets in that range. When someone is 3-betting somewhere between 4 and 8%, it's kind of a grey area where you know they definitely do have some light 3-bets in their range if you have a sufficient sample size, but there also isn't really that much you can do about it. So in some ways, perhaps that's a good 3-bet percentage to have yourself, because it's a difficult 3-bet percentage to play against. And some of the other times we may consider calling is if we think we have the odds to set mine, and that is going to depend on the stack sizes and our implied odds. And basically, if you're 100 big blinds deep, it's usually not going to be a good idea to set mine. And the reason is you need to get paid off very, very often when you hit your set in order for it to be profitable to set mine in a 3-bet pot. And realistically, it probably is just not going to happen and be profitable. So ideally, you are going to want your villain to be perhaps 140 big blinds plus before you can consider set mining. Ideally, you want to follow the call 20 rule, which states you need to make 20 times your initial investment post flop, and see the video on set mining for full details on that. But in general, it's not going to be a good idea to set mine in 3-bet pots unless your opponent is very, very tight, or the stacks are deeper than 100 big blinds. Okay, so as said, we can 4-bet versus light 3-betters, and by light I mean 8% plus ideally. And in terms of ranges, if we have access to this information, which we may not after a few hands, but if we know that villain is 3-betting a polarized range, then we want to 4-bet a polarized range versus this. And we do this because villain, if he's 3-betting a polarized range, then he's likely going to have a high fold to 4-bet, because his bluff hands are just not going to be able to continue. So the only part of his range that can continue is the smaller value part of that range. However, if we know that villain is the type to 3-bet a merged range, so he's not really bluffing, he's just taking the top X% of hands and 3-betting those, then we want to 4-bet a merged range against his merged 3-betting range. And the reason is that most villains that are 3-betting a merged range are going to have a low fold to 4-bet. Not always. If they have a high fold to 4-bet, then you can perhaps continue to 4-bet a polarized range because they are folding quite often. But against merged 3-betters who typically have a low fold to 4-bet, you are going to want to 4-bet a merged range, and probably not that wide a range, but just 4-bet a merged narrow value range, because it's likely they're going to continue. So there's no reason to not get some more chips in pre-flop when you have an equity edge. And low fold to 4-bet obviously includes people that are playing the 3-bet, 4-bet, 5-bet game aggressively, and you know they are going to jam very wide over your 4-bet because perhaps you've created the dynamic where they are expecting you to 4-bet bluff, and if they're expecting you to 4-bet bluff, this is a great spot to show up with a merged 4-bet range. And when they 5-bet over the top, then you can obviously snap call, and they're going to be light, and you're going to have a strong 4-bet range which contains merged value. So one final thing, as discussed, we need to keep in mind positional awareness when facing 3-bets. So it's one thing if we're on the cutoff and button 3-bets, but if we're under the gun and the small blind decides to 3-bet us, it probably or possibly doesn't matter if he is 3-betting 10% of the time. That doesn't mean he's 3-betting 10% of the time from the small blind versus under the gun. Perhaps he only 3-bets 2% of the time from the small blind versus under the gun. So remember that positions are crucial in establishing how you are going to respond to 3-bets, because it tells you a lot of information about the range that player is 3-betting. Okay, so in position, things become both slightly easier because we're in position, but also a little bit more complex because we have more options at our disposal. When we're in position, flatting becomes a much better option, so we can take a slightly wider range and we can perhaps begin to flat in position, especially if we think players are 3-betting light. If we don't think they are 3-betting light, folding should still be our default play if we think they're 3-betting very tightly. So if they are 3-betting less than 4%, in fact you'll come across some players who are literally 3-betting 2.5% of hands. If this is the case and you open ace queen or ace jack from the button and you get 3-bet, just fold, because you are going to be behind their range and it's going to be very difficult to play it profitably even in position, and they are 3-betting you so infrequently that your best option is just to continue perhaps selling their blinds or whatever it is you are doing. So your default play should still be to fold versus tight 3-betters. If we are ever going to consider flatting, it's really going to be people that are 3-betting you light. And we generally want to flat against people that are 3-betting a polarized range for the reasons discussed in the previous frame, that if someone is 3-betting a polarized range, by flatting you allow all of their bluffs to continue in the hand, and you have very good equity against their combined range, whereas by 4-betting you are folding out the bluff part of their range and only isolating yourselves against the value part, which you are not going to have as good equity against. And the same as out of position, we want to 4-bet value hands against a merged 3-betting range, because it's likely that villain is going to continue, is going to have a low fold to 4-bet if he is 3-betting a merged value range. And in actual fact, a lot of whether a range is merged or polarized is in the mind of villain. For example, if villain 3-bets a hand like a7 suited, well, technically, if you analyzed it theoretically, if someone's 3-betting 8-7 suited, it's technically a bluff because they have 8 high. But in villain's mind, he may well be 3-betting a hand like 8-7 suited for value, and if he's 3-betting that hand for value inside his psychological consciousness, then he is going to be less likely to fold that hand to a 4-bet, because he 3-bet it in the first place because he wanted to get more chips in the pot with what he decided was a good hand, and when he gets 4-bet, he doesn't want to then fold because that was his initial intention, to get more chips in the pot. Whereas if psychologically he thinks in his mind that he is doing it as a bluff, then when he gets 4-bet, it's an easy decision, just fold, because his bluff didn't work out. So against especially light 3-betters, you can expand your calling range to include non-standard hands like mid-pocket pairs and suited connectors. And hopefully you can see the implication here that these are not standard hands to call 3-bets with. So if someone is 3-betting not that light and you have a suited connector on the button and they 3-bet you light from the blinds, yes, perhaps you were in position, but you should really be folding your suited connector. 100 big blinds deep, it's going to be a leak to flat call 3-bets with suited connectors, because as discussed a bit earlier in the video series, they are hands that rely on a high stack to pot ratio in order to be profitable, and in a 3-bet pot that is just not going to be there. You are not going to have the implied odds to make the hand profitable, and against a tight 3-betting range you are not going to have the fold equity to make the hand profitable. However, against a light 3-betting range, you are quite likely going to have some post-flop fold equity, and it's this that makes a hand profitable. The call with a hand like 10-9 suited in itself is not profitable necessarily, but you are going to have many more opportunities to steal post-flop, partly because you're in position, but also partly because villain has a much wider and weaker range. And we will go on to discuss how we then proceed post-flop in the next video series, the next video even. But for now it suffices to know that you are going to need to make some steal attempts where possible in order for the hand to be profitable. And finally, just to reiterate, positional awareness is very important in helping to establish what range someone is 3-betting with, what type of hands. So you need to take that into account when deciding how you are going to respond to your opponent's 3-bet. So this concludes part 2. In the next part we are going to go on to consider how we are going to play post flop in 3-bet pots.